In this lecture, you'll learn about the Input Manager. And the Input Manager is great because it lets us map named axes to particular inputs from a mouse or a keyboard or a gamepad or whatever. The powerful idea behind this is from within our scripts, we can then check for and process input on a particular axis by name. This is a pretty basic Unity project. I've just taken the default template project and renamed my scene to Scene 0 because we're just going to look at how we get at the Input Manager and explore it a little bit, and then we'll actually use it in the next lecture. To get to the Input Manager, we pick Edit, Project Settings, and then we pick Input Manager, and you'll notice that we have a recommendation here that says consider using the new input system package instead. And as I mentioned in the lesson introduction, we're going to defer using the new input system package because it requires you to understand some C# programming concepts that we don't have yet. So we're going to use this input system instead. I said we can map inputs to axes. At this point, it looks like there are no input axes, but if we click the arrow next to axes, we can see we actually get 30 input axes by default. Let's take a look at the horizontal one. So each axis has a name that we can use to determine whether there's input on that axis from within our scripts by using the name. Each input axis has a negative button and a positive button. So if we provide input on the negative button, then the value we get for this axis will be negative. And if we provide input on the positive button, the input we get from this axis will be positive. And we also have an alternative negative button and positive button. So this particular axis is structured so that either left or A will provide negative input, and either right or D will provide positive input on the horizontal axis. So this is a pretty standard horizontal movement input scheme. There's some other settings that we can use that I tend not to end up using. This is a keyboard or mouse button mapping, and that is certainly the most common mapping we'll use. We will use joystick axis mappings if we're responding to a thumbstick, for example, on a joystick, but we'd also use key or mouse button if we're responding to joystick buttons. And one of the great things about the Input Manager is I'll collapse this horizontal axis, but you'll see there's another horizontal axis down here. And this one actually is on a joystick. So we'll get input from a thumbstick, a joystick axis on a gamepad, in the x-axis, so the horizontal direction, and we can even say which joystick this particular axis maps to. The default is you get motion from all joysticks, so any joystick would be providing horizontal axis input, but of course you can set it up so you have horizontal player 1 and horizontal player 2, and different joysticks would provide those different inputs. What's so great about this is that within our script, all we have to do is find out whether we have input on the horizontal axis. And we don't care if it came from a joystick or a keyboard or the mouse or some other device. We just know we have input on the horizontal axis. So it separates the actions we're trying to accomplish, like move horizontally, from the actual device input that the player is using to try to accomplish that action. I will say that the new input system does this awesome mapping between actions and inputs to implement that same separation of actions from the actual player input, but using the Input Manager also lets us separate those actions from how we're actually getting input on those actions, so we'll just use the Input Manager. To recap, in this lecture you saw how we can use the Input Manager to map named input axes to particular inputs, which really lets us set up the control scheme for our game.